Before Rome built its roads, before Greece wrote its philosophy, before any empire you were taught to admire had drawn its first breath. One civilization had already connected the known world from Egypt to India, declared the first human rights in recorded history, and built a city so magnificent that its ruins still silence visitors 25 centuries after its destruction. And then a young Macedonian king, 25 years old and drunk on his own legend, burned it to the ground in a single night. This is the story of the Persian Empire, the world's first superpower. The civilization history forgot to celebrate, and the man who ended it in revenge for a wrong committed 150 years before he was born. Long before the word Persian meant anything to the ancient world, the plateau of Iran was a crossroads of forgotten peoples. The Elamites built cities in the southwestern lowlands before 3000 BC, trading with Mesopotamia and developing their own script while most of the world still communicated in gesture and memory. The Medes, a fierce Iranian people from the northwest, rose to destroy the hated Assyrian Empire in 612 BC, a moment of such collective ancient joy that the prophet Nahum in the Hebrew Bible celebrated it in verse. For a brief generation, the Medes were the dominant power on the Iranian plateau. They built their capital at Ecbatana, modern Hamadan, in the cool mountain air of northwestern Iran, and they looked south toward a smaller Iranian tribe in the foothills of the Zagros Mountains, with the comfortable contempt of the powerful toward the weak. That smaller tribe was called the Persians. And, in 559 BC, a young Persian king looked back at the Medes with something entirely different in his eyes. His name was Cyrus II, and when he inherited the small Persian kingdom of Anshan in 559 BC, his entire domain could have fit inside a single Median province. The Medes looked at him and saw a vassal, a tributary, a minor king of a minor people who would pay his taxes and cause no trouble. They were wrong, in a way that would echo for 2,500 years. Within 10 years of taking his throne, Cyrus had done something no one in the ancient world had predicted. He defeated the Median king Astyages, absorbed the entire Median kingdom, and inherited its armies, its treasury, and its alliances. He did not stop there. In 547 BC, he turned west and defeated Croesus of Lydia, the man whose name became synonymous with wealth itself, and took the entire western coast of Anatolia. Then in 539 BC, he turned south toward Babylon, the greatest city on earth, a metropolis of perhaps 200,000 people behind walls so thick that ancient sources claim chariots could race side by side along their tops. The gates of Babylon opened without a battle. Cyrus walked in as a liberator, and what he did next changed the moral history of the world. The Cyrus cylinder, a clay barrel inscribed in Akkadian cuneiform discovered in Babylon in 1879 and now housed in the British Museum, is one of the most extraordinary documents in human history. In it, Cyrus declared freedom of religion for all peoples under his rule, ordered the return of displaced populations, Empire suddenly stretched from the Aegean to the Nile, from Central Asia to the first cataracts of the greatest river in Africa. But Cambyses proved unstable. Ancient sources describe him murdering his own brother, desecrating Egyptian temples, and executing advisors on irrational suspicion. Whether these accounts are entirely accurate or Egyptian and Greek propaganda is debated by historians to this day. What is not debated is the outcome. Cambyses died in 522 BC under mysterious circumstances while rushing home to deal with a rebellion, and the empire he had expanded teetered on the edge of civil war. Into this crisis stepped a man who was not the direct heir to the throne, but who possessed something more valuable than bloodline. He possessed the administrative genius to save what Cyrus had built. His name was Darius, and he would become the greatest organizer in the ancient world. Darius I seized power in 522 BC after defeating 9 rebel kings in a single year, a military and political achievement he recorded in the massive Behistun inscription carved into a cliff face in western Iran, still readable today. Then, instead of simply consolidating power through force, he did something extraordinary. He rebuilt the entire empire from its foundations. He divided the empire into 20 satrapies, each governed by a satrap, a regional administrator with real authority to govern locally, collect taxes, and maintain order, but answerable to the king through a network of royal inspectors called the eyes and ears of the king, who travelled the empire constantly checking on every satrap's loyalty and competence. He standardized weights and measures across 30 different cultures. He minted the first gold coin in Persian history, the staric, creating a unified monetary system from Egypt to India. He built the Royal Road, a 1,600-mile highway from Sardis on the Aegean coast to Susa in southwestern Iran, with postal relay stations every 15 miles, so a message could travel the entire length in 7 days. Then he built Persepolis, a ceremonial capital, on a raised stone platform in the highlands of Fars province, built not for defense or commerce but purely for grandeur, to make every visitor understand, before a single word was spoken, the scale of what they were dealing with. The Apadanuk audience hall could accommodate 10,000 people. Its columns rose 20 meters. Its carved stairway reliefs showed ambassadors from 23 nations, each one individually depicted with their own clothing, hairstyles, gifts, and facial features, bringing tribute to the king. This was not art for art's sake. This was political communication at architectural scale, and it worked for 200 years. But then Darius turned his attention west toward the irritating Greek city-states along his Aegean frontier and made the decision that would haunt his dynasty for 3 generations. The Ionian Greeks of western Anatolia, Persian subjects, had revolted in 499 BC, aided by ships and soldiers sent from Athens and the city of Eretria on the Greek mainland. Darius crushed the revolt brutally. Then he sent his fleet across the Aegean to punish the cities that had dared to interfere in his empire's internal affairs. Eretria was burned to the ground. But in 490 BC, at a small beach called Marathon, 26 miles north of Athens, something happened that Darius had not planned for, had not imagined possible, and would not live long enough to avenge. The Athenians, outnumbered and without Spartan support, charged the Persian line at a dead run and broke it so completely that the survivors fled to their ships in panic. Darius died in 486 BC, still planning his return to Greece, and he left behind a son named Xerxes, who had watched Marathon's humiliation from the court and spent his entire young manhood waiting for the chance to erase it. It was at this moment that the Persian Empire reached the apex of its ambition and began, without knowing it, the long arc toward its end. Because the campaign Xerxes was about to launch against Greece would not destroy Persia in a day. Empires do not fall in a day, but it would plant the seed of a humiliation that a Macedonian king, born a century after Thermopylae, would water into the final fire. Xerxes I became king of kings in 486 BC, and he prepared his Greek campaign with a thoroughness that bordered on obsession. For 4 years, he assembled the largest army the ancient world had ever seen, soldiers conscripted from every corner of an empire that spanned 3 continents. Ethiopians in leopard skins, Indian infantry in cotton armor, Scythian horsemen from the Central Asian steppe, Egyptian marines, Bactrian cavalry. Ancient sources place the number at over 1 million men, Modern historians estimate somewhere between 150,000 and 300,000, which remains the largest military force assembled in the ancient world up to that point. He dug a canal through the Athos Peninsula in northern Greece so his fleet could avoid a dangerous cape. He built 2 pontoon bridges of 674 ships, each across the Hellespont, the strait between Asia and Europe. And when a storm destroyed the first bridges, he reportedly ordered the sea whipped 300 times as punishment. In 480 BC, his army crossed into Europe and the ground shook under its weight. Greek city-states across northern Greece fell without a fight. Thessaly, Macedonia, Thebes all submitted. Only a stubborn coalition of 31 city-states, led by Athens and Sparta, chose resistance. And at a narrow coastal pass called Thermopylae, 300 Spartans under King Leonidas stopped the largest army in history for 3 days, until a Greek shepherd named Ephialtes showed the Persians a secret mountain path, and the pass was lost to betrayal rather than battle. Xerxes took Athens. He burned the Acropolis, the sacred hill with its ancient temples, to the ground, settling accounts for the Athenian ships sent to support the Ionian revolt 20 years earlier. Standing in the ruins of the most intellectually alive city in the ancient world, Xerxes must have felt the weight of the completed mission. His father's humiliation at Marathon was answered. The city that had defied him was ash. But then, in September 480 BC, the Athenian admiral Themistocles lured the Persian fleet into the narrow strait of Salamis, using the same geographic logic Leonidas had used at Thermopylae, and destroyed it in a single afternoon. Without his fleet, Xerxes could not supply his massive land army. The greatest king in the world retreated back across the Hellespont with a fraction of the force he had brought. The following year, at Plataea in 479 BC, the remaining Persian land army was destroyed. Greece had survived, and Persia, though it would continue for another 150 years, had revealed, for the first time, that it could be beaten. Xerxes never recovered. His later years were marked by court conspiracies, harem intrigues, and the slow withdrawal of a man whose greatest ambition had publicly failed. He retreated into the pleasures of Persepolis and the management of an empire that ran largely on the administrative machinery Darius had built. In 465 BC, he was murdered in his bedroom by a court official named Artaxerxes, the most powerful king on earth, dead in the dark, killed by a man he trusted. The manner of his death was more eloquent than any battle, and it established a pattern: palace assassination, court intrigue, disputed succession, that would weaken the Achaemenid throne for the next 130 years, king by king, until a young Macedonian arrived at the gates of Persepolis with fire in his hands and revenge in his heart. With Xerxes dead and the Greek campaigns a permanent wound on Persian imperial pride, the empire entered its long afternoon. It did not collapse. It did not shrink. In many ways, it continued to function brilliantly. The satrapies collected taxes, the royal road carried trade, Persepolis received ambassadors from across the known world. But the throne itself became a prize fought over by brothers, generals, and court eunuchs. And into this slow imperial twilight, from the cold mountains of Macedonia in northern Greece, a new threat was sharpening itself with 20 years of military education and one singular, all-consuming obsession. Artaxerxes I, who took the throne after his father Xerxes' murder in 465 BC, proved a more capable ruler than his turbulent accession suggested. He managed the empire with reasonable competence for 40 years, suppressing a major revolt in Egypt, negotiating a formal peace with Athens, the Peace of Callias in 449 BC. That effectively ended the Greco-Persian Wars and stabilized the western frontier. Under Artaxerxes, Persian gold became a weapon more effective than Persian spears. The empire funded whichever Greek city-state was currently fighting the others, playing Athens and Sparta against each other in the ruinous Peloponnesian War with the patience and financial sophistication of a power that understood it could outlast Greek unity. When Sparta and Athens exhausted each other over 27 years of war, it was Persian money that had quietly accelerated the destruction of both. This was Persian foreign policy at its most subtle and most effective, and it worked brilliantly, keeping Greece fractured and weak for another generation. The Persian Empire, in this period, was the quiet architect of Greek self-destruction. Under Artaxerxes II, who ruled the longest of all Achaemenid kings from 404 to 358 BC, the empire demonstrated its remarkable capacity for survival. When Artaxerxes II faced a direct challenge from his own brother Cyrus the Younger, who hired 10,000 Greek mercenaries, the famous soldiers of Xenophon's Anabasis, to march deep into Persian territory, the empire absorbed the threat, killed the pretender at the Battle of Cunaxa in 411 BC, and watched those 10,000 Greeks make their extraordinary retreat to the Black Sea. The empire endured. Artaxerxes II also presided over a remarkable cultural flowering. The arts, architecture, and religious life of the Persian heartland continued to flourish. The temples at Susa were rebuilt and expanded, and Persian court culture reached a level of sophistication that would not be matched in the region for centuries. The empire, at its administrative core, still functioned. The machinery Darius had built was genuinely extraordinary, capable of running almost independently of whoever sat on the throne. Yet every decade brought new evidence that the throne itself was corroding. Artaxerxes III, who finally stabilized the succession in 358 BC by reportedly murdering 80 of his own brothers to eliminate competition, ruled with brutal effectiveness but was himself poisoned in 338 BC by his own vizier, Bagoas, a court eunuch who became the real power behind the Persian throne for several critical years, installing and murdering puppet kings with a casualness that revealed how completely the center of the empire had rotted. Darius III, the last Achaemenid king, was placed on the throne by Bagoas in 336 BC, and immediately had Bagoas killed when he discovered the vizier planned to poison him too. Darius III was not a coward or a fool, but he was inheriting a throne whose foundations had been undermined for generations. And in the same year he became king, a 20-year-old Macedonian named Alexander III crossed into Asia Minor with 40,000 soldiers and the absolute conviction that the Persian Empire was his to take. Then, from the cold mountains of Macedonia, the threat that Persia's long political decline had made inevitable finally arrived. Not as a barbarian invasion, not as a nomadic flood, but as a single young man with a philosophical education, a military genius inherited from his father Philip, and a personal mythology so carefully constructed that he genuinely believed himself the son of a god, come to finish what the Persian Wars had started 150 years before. Alexander III of Macedon crossed into Asia in 334 BC with 40,000 infantry, 6,000 cavalry, and an empty treasury. He had approximately 30 days of supplies when he landed. His speed was the strategy. Before the Persian satraps of Western Anatolia could organize a coordinated defense, Alexander had won the Battle of the Granicus River and was moving south along the Aegean coast, liberating or conquering, depending on your perspective, the Greek cities of Ionia that had been under Persian rule for 2 centuries. Darius III, recognizing the scale of the threat, personally led an enormous Persian army to meet Alexander at Issus in 333 BC, a battle that demonstrated both Alexander's tactical genius and Darius's catastrophic misjudgment of terrain. Darius chose a narrow coastal plain that neutralized his numerical advantage, the same geographic mistake that had doomed Xerxes at Salamis. Alexander smashed through the Persian left flank, drove directly toward Darius's royal chariot, and Darius fled the battlefield, leaving behind his mother, his wife, his daughters, and his treasury. Alexander treated Darius's captured family with elaborate personal courtesy, a deliberate political performance designed to show the Persian people that he intended to rule as a successor to the Achaemenid kings, not merely as a conqueror. It was one of the most sophisticated acts of political theatre in military history. And it worked. By 3031 BC, Alexander had conquered Egypt, where the priests of the oracle at Siwa declared him the son of the god Ammon, and turned east to face Darius one final time. At Gaugamela in modern Iraq, on a flat plain that Darius had specifically chosen and even pre-cleared of obstacles to allow his war chariots and elephants maximum effectiveness, the two armies met in the largest battle of the ancient world. Darius had assembled perhaps 250,000 men. Alexander commanded 47,000. The Persian line was so long that it overlapped Alexander's flanks completely. Darius had learned from Issus, or thought he had. Alexander had planned for Gaugamela with a precision that modern military historians still study. He deliberately created a gap in his own line, drew the Persian cavalry into it, then pivoted his elite companion cavalry in a wedge directly at Darius's position. For the second time, Darius looked up from his royal chariot and saw Alexander coming straight at him through the chaos of battle. For the second time, Darius fled. The Persian army, seeing its king running, collapsed. The battle was over by afternoon. The Persian Empire, as a political and military reality, ended on that plain in a single afternoon in October 31 BC. Persepolis fell to Alexander without a siege. The treasury, containing 120,000 talents of gold and silver, the accumulated wealth of 2 centuries of imperial taxation from 30 nations, was loaded onto 20,000 mules and 5,000 camels and carried west. It was the largest transfer of wealth in the ancient world. Then came the night that history has never entirely forgiven. At a banquet in Persepolis in the spring of 3030 BC, after weeks of celebrations and excess, a fire started in the palace complex, the magnificent ceremonial capital that Darius I had spent decades building, that had received ambassadors from every nation on earth whose carved reliefs recorded the faces and clothing of 23 civilizations. Ancient sources differ on whether Alexander ordered the burning deliberately, in revenge for Xerxes' burning of Athens 150 years earlier, or whether it began as a drunken accident suggested by an Athenian courtesan named Thais. Arrian, Alexander's most reliable ancient biographer, suggests Alexander later regretted it. The fire did not care about regret. The columns cracked, the carved reliefs blackened, the cedar roof beams, imported from Lebanon at enormous expense, collapsed in towers of orange flame. The greatest building the ancient world had produced, burned through the Persian night. And Darius III, the last king of kings, fleeing east with the remnants of his court, was murdered by his own satrap Bessus before Alexander could reach him, denied even the dignity of a death at the hands of his conqueror. Alexander found his body on a dusty road in eastern Iran and reportedly wept. Then he covered it with his own cloak and ordered it sent to Persepolis for royal burial. It was a gesture of respect for a man he had destroyed. History is full of such contradictions. With Darius III dead in the dust, and Persepolis a field of ash and broken stone, the Achaemenid Persian Empire, which had begun with one young king and a small kingdom in the hills of Fars province, ceased to exist after 228 years. But the story does not end in rubble, because empires do not simply stop, they transform. They sink into the soil of the civilizations that replace them and continue invisibly in language and law and architecture and memory long after the last king is buried. What Cyrus built was not merely an empire of territory. It was an empire of ideas. The concept of human rights, the radical notion that a conqueror had obligations toward the conquered, that religious diversity was a strength rather than a threat, that different peoples could live under one administration without surrendering their identity. These ideas did not die in the fire at Persepolis. They survived in the Cyrus Cylinder, which the United Nations adopted as an early symbol of human rights in 1971. They survived in the administrative model that Alexander himself adopted, keeping Persian satraps in place, wearing Persian dress, attempting to fuse Macedonian and Persian court culture in what his own generals considered an act of cultural betrayal. The Persian model of empire, tolerant, administratively sophisticated, religiously plural, proved more durable than the Persian army that failed to defend it. Alexander's own empire barely survived his death in 3023 BC. The Achaemenid system he had conquered and adapted outlasted him by generations, absorbed into the Seleucid, Parthian, and eventually Sasanian Persian empires that rose from its ruins. Iran remained. Iran, culturally, linguistically, administratively continuous. Through Greek conquest, Parthian restoration, Roman pressure, and Arab invasion, a civilizational identity so robust that it absorbed every conqueror who thought they had erased it. Today, modern Iranians stand at Persepolis, a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and look at the carved faces of their ancestors on walls that Cyrus commissioned and Alexander burned, and they feel something that has no simple name. Pride and grief simultaneously. The knowledge of what was built and what was lost and what survived anyway. The West inherited the Persian Wars as a story about Greek heroism, the free democracies of Athens and Sparta defending civilization against Eastern tyranny. This narrative, established by Herodotus and amplified by 2 millennia of Western scholarship, contains truth. It also contains a profound distortion. The Persian Empire was not tyranny. It was the most sophisticated, most tolerant, most administratively advanced civilization the ancient world had yet produced. A civilization that freed slaves, declared human rights, and connected 30 nations under a single administration, while Athens was still debating who counted as a citizen. The story of Persia is not the story of the villain in someone else's heroic narrative. It is its own story, older, larger, and in many ways more consequential than the story of the civilization that defeated it at Marathon and Salamis. Alexander understood this, which is why he wept over Darius's body and ordered Persepolis rebuilt after burning it, why he married a Bactrian princess named Roxana and adopted Persian court customs, why he spent the last years of his life trying to fuse the Macedonian and Persian worlds into something new. The tomb of Cyrus the Great still stands at Pasargadae in southern Iran, a simple stone structure on 6-step tiers, surrounded by the remains of gardens that were once the most beautiful in the ancient world. When Alexander visited it during his eastern campaign, he found it had been broken into and looted by his own soldiers. He ordered it restored. He ordered an inscription placed inside. Ancient sources disagree on whether it read something like, "Whoever you are and wherever you come from, for I know you will come. I am Cyrus, who gave the Persians their empire. Do not begrudge me this little earth that covers my body." Whether Alexander actually placed that inscription or whether it was already there, the words survived because they carried a truth that 2,500 years have not diminished. Every empire ends. Every conqueror becomes dust. Every city that believes itself eternal eventually becomes a ruin that strangers photograph on a Tuesday afternoon. What survives is not the empire. It is the idea the empire carried, and whether that idea was worth the cost of everything that built it and everything that burned it down. Cyrus built an empire on the idea that power did not require cruelty, that strength did not require the destruction of the weak, that a king could be remembered not for what he destroyed but for what he allowed to live. 25 centuries later, in a world that still struggles with every one of those questions, that idea feels less like ancient history and more like unfinished business.